Okay, right. I believe this is now working. So, welcome to the book launch for Pantheon Egyptians, which is part of a series written by a whole variety of people looking at the pantheons of Greeks, Romans, Norse deities, Celtic deities, etc. My entry into the series, as well, as you can probably see, is on the Egyptian deities. So the book is now out, available for order via online sources like Waterstones Online, Amazon, local bookshops you can go into and order it from there. You can acquire the book from a whole variety of sources as you would any other book. Now, as is the standard format for book launches, I'm going to read you a small section in a moment, and then I'll give you a talk on a number of issues, but related to the theme of tension within Egyptian mythology between deities who exist in a kind of heated relationship with each other, and how that pans out into our understanding of Egyptian mythology and religion, both in the ancient world as well as in terms of modern day practice, because the book looks at both the ancient context and modern day practice. But before we get on to that, I thought I'd start with a prayer, which I'll read to you in Egyptian, or at least a reconstruction of Egyptian, and then I'll give you the English translation of it. I'll be keeping an eye on the comments section as well, because people participating in this can type comments as we go along, so you can ask questions, you can make requests, suggestions, etc., and I'll respond to you as quickly as I can keep track of the comments as they appear. So, to start. Unrea, apurea an chahute, nutef tui, entbaat, entpet enti, apref, reun negeru am es. Give me voice. May my mouth be opened by Chahute, with that divine instrument of iron which the gods were given voice. Okay, now, just to set the scene for the book itself, the book comes in a number of chapters, and all of the entries in this series follow a very similar layout and format. We're beginning with looking at ancient Egyptian history, and sort of setting a historical scene as to what we know of ancient Egypt and how Egypt related to other nation states around the world, both then and has had an influence in subsequent centuries, or even after the Egyptian period as we know it, the period of worship of the old gods faded away and new empires came in and took over. Nonetheless, the culture, the inheritance, the depth of understanding and insight, both scientific and mystical and other forms of understanding that were to be found in ancient Egypt, have persisted, influencing Europe, influencing Africa, influencing Asia, influencing other parts of the world in the millennia since the end of the Egyptian Empire as we understand it. So the history chapter sets that context hopefully well enough for people. This is not intended to be an academic book, but go into just enough depth to give you an understanding of the historical sources. Second chapter, we move into talking about Egyptian mythology. Now, there is an awful lot of Egyptian mythology, so this is cherry-picked. It's elements of Egyptian mythology to try and give you a flavour and overview. And it's aimed at people who, some of whom will have a good understanding of Egyptian myth already, so taking it into hopefully more depth, and others who may be first time or relative newcomers to Egyptian mythology, giving them the basics and an understanding thereof. We'll then move into talking about the cosmology and the worldview of the ancient Egyptians. Now, ancient Egypt as a culture changed over the period of many millennia and included lots of tribal districts. We can't assume there was absolute consistency in culture or in religion or in general spiritual metaphysical understandings throughout that time and across the entirety of the Egyptian culture. So this is looking at changing patterns and shifts as time went on, and how we as people in the 21st century can understand the outlook of the ancient world and how their ideas can shape our ideas as we understand the world around us today. From there we look at ritual structure and calendar, and that's both reflecting on what we do know of the ritual structure and calendar that was used in ancient times, but also how we can then engage with ritual to interact with the Netjeru, the deities, to interact with the Ahu, the revered dead, to interact with a whole variety of other beings within a spiritual context, and to shape the ritual year, regardless of whether people these days live in Egypt or they live in Britain, in any of the European countries, in any of the African countries, in Australia, in America, and wherever, how they can engage with the calendar of the ancient world. Hello, Catherine. From there, we move on to talk about ethics and philosophy in the 5th chapter, which is pretty much what it says on the tin, looking at chiefly the negative confession, which was a series of what's also called the Declaration of Innocence, a series of 42 statements that were to be made by the newly deceased in front of a panel of 42 assessors. What we can understand of that in terms of what it tells us about how the Egyptians believed we should live a moral life, an upstanding life, what we should or should not do in terms of living the good life. So giving an understanding of the philosophy there. Chapter 6 looks at the idea of magic, which is quite prominent in ancient Egyptian belief and practice. Not everyone in ancient Egypt was running around engaging in magical acts every 5 minutes, but it's a persistent theme throughout, particularly the concept of heka, of spoken magic, where certain words have power and are to be used and resonated to immense effect in Egyptian philosophy and religion by the Netjeru, the gods themselves, but also potentially by mere mortals such as ourselves. Chapter 7 goes on to talk about the Netjeru, the gods, in a broader context. Now, there are a huge number of deities recorded in the sources of information we have from ancient Egypt, so I've made no attempt to cover every single one of them. We've made a massive book to do that. But I've taken some key deities who appeal to me personally and interest me, of whom I have some degree of understanding, and gone into a bit more depth on them and given some background detail upon the wider pantheon of gods. From there we go to chapter 8, which talks about other spirit beings, the revered dead and the angry dead, and a whole raft of other entities, both beneficial to humans but also some which are quite malevolent towards human beings, and how we understand them and engage with them, or in case the malevolent ones avoid them like the plague. How to perceive the world, or at least how the Egyptians themselves perceive the world around them, with the hope that perhaps people reading this might start to reflect whether that makes sense to them. It may do, it may not, but hopefully gives food for thought in terms of understanding the Egyptians. And for people who feel a connection to Egyptian deities today, prompts some deeper reflection on life. Chapter 9 is applying the concepts. So a lot of it, up for the first 8 chapters, has been quite heavy on the historical. Chapter 9 is getting people to think about how do we live these ideas in the 21st century if we wish to do so. What are the dilemmas, the challenges, the opportunities for applying these ideas and concepts in modern day life, particularly for people who no longer live in Egypt. So how that tradition, which was so very rooted in one specific country, can be carried over into people living in other parts of the world. And lastly, the final chapter is Quo Vadis? Where next? Where do we go from here? Having reached the end of the book, where does that lead us to? Where does it take us forward into understanding our spiritual practice in the future, and where we go from after that? But I'll just pause for breath and take a quick look to see if there's any more comments being posted. Okay, it doesn't look like it's so far, but do feel free to chip in as you go along. So what I'm going to do now is adjust myself to sit a little bit more comfortably. I think I'll sit up here, in fact, get a bit more comfortable, and read you a small section from the book, and then we'll have a discussion around tensions between different deities and how that can be understood in a wider context. So the small section I'm going to read you is from the chapter on the Necheru, the gods. This is a reflection, or part of, I won't read you the whole thing, but part of a reflection on a particular deity called Wet-Wawet, who is sometimes also known as Akwat, and by a whole raft of different titles. The chief of his titles being the Opener of the Ways. A dispute exists as to whether the grey animal depicted as Wet-Wawet's head is a wolf, as the Greeks believed, and so translated the name of his chief site of worship as a Lycopolis, city of the wolf, or a jackal. The Canis Anthoslupasta has been defined as both a wolf and a jackal by different zoologists. Personal gnosis suggests Wet-Wawet is decidedly lupine in nature, but other people will equally swear that their gnosis reveals him to be a jackal. Perhaps, like most divine beings, he is whatever he wishes to be on a given occasion. A probable son of Sethech, though the exact family tree is variable depending on the sources read, he stands as the brother to Anpu, whom Greeks called Anubis, and shares a dual function with him in their service to both the souls and bodies of the dead. His name may be translated as either Opener of the Ways or Opener of the Roads. In this latter capacity, it is possible that he may have had patronage over travellers and those who create roadways. Other titles attributed to him include Extinguisher of Breaths, a role suggestive of death itself, and perhaps a being that not only severs the final ties of life, but maybe guides the soul on the journey into the afterlife. Wet-Wawet is a key figure in the ceremony of the opening of the mouth, which was once performed over mummified bodies as a means to grant them speech and other capacities in the afterlife. The only known part of the festival calendar associated with the wolf god is the Hebsed, which is not so much yearly as a jubilee to mark the 30th anniversary of the pharaoh's reign, and again at 3 to 4 year intervals consequent to that, very few rulers living long enough to mark many of those. For a 21st century devotee, the Sed festival would be rare to impossible, depending on the country a person lived in. Whilst a British monarch could potentially see out 3 decades on the throne, and the current one at the time of writing certainly has, an American president, fortunately, cannot be so long in office. The festival, if it is to be marked at all, would need to be adapted to celebrate the idea of long service by whatever stretch of time it is understood in the devotee's homeland. If the Hebsed is to be regarded as a celebration of long rule by the national leader, in whichever country the person is resident, then it raises a philosophical question as to whether all leaders should be equally honoured, or if the individual Kemetic should exercise some personal political bias in only honouring the reign of rulers of whom they approve. In a ritual group, this could lead to a potential degree of tension, should some members admire and wish to honour a politician or monarch whom other members despise. Whilst attendance at religious ritual must always be voluntary, it clearly becomes somewhat awkward if there are members staying away effectively as a protest, rather than due to some pragmatic concern, childcare difficulties or such like. The activities of the Hebsed required the pharaoh to engage in various activities which could hardly be expected of a modern political leader, so a deal of adaptation would be needed. In spell 42 of Ru Nu Peret En Haru, given earlier in this chapter, Wet-Wawet is associated with the ears, which may be suggestive of the alert wolf of the desert, always keeping an ear open for sounds of prey or a potential threat. The list of body parts could also be seen as indicative of which deity to turn to for healing, with respect to illnesses or injuries to that region. Those wishing to commune with the wolf god in ritual are welcome to use the following poem of the author's own devising. It has previously been featured in the collection Moon Poets by the same publisher. And I'll just read you the first 3 verses of the poem. Awaken in peace, beloved of the sun, awaken in peace, follower of the moon. Desert wanderer, maker of tracks in the pathless wastes, grey light in a red land. The door is bolted to me, confined within my mind. Opener of the ways, unlock what I cannot. And the poem continues on from there. Oh, we've had another question. Hello, David. That was a hello rather than a question. So, just to move from there to talk in more general terms, not specifically about the book, but about Egyptian philosophy, Egyptian mythology and religion. I'll aim to stop talking just so that you know, for those of you thinking about your dinner or your evening's activities, off doing whatever you wish to do, I'm going to aim to stop talking at about 8:30, so this launch will last, probably slightly over an hour because I'm appalling at timekeeping, but also when I stop talking at 8:30, hello, I will then open it up to a bit of Q&A. Speaking of which, we do have a question already there. From Venetia about shape-shifting and whether all deities are capable. I would say, actually, I wouldn't want to attempt to limit what deities are capable of. It's rather than misses the point of being a deity if you're limited by human imagination. But certainly all of the deities within the Egyptian Pantheon whose stories that I'm familiar with, which is by no means absolutely all of the deities, but the ones I am familiar with all engage in some form of shape-shifting and movement between different guises. And likewise for those deities in other cultures that I'm familiar with, shape-shifting is very commonplace. So the notion of experiencing a deity who might walk the earth appearing to be a perfectly ordinary human, which is an idea that obviously had a huge inspiration on Neil Gaiman when he was writing American Gods in the follow-up book Anansi Boys, where the gods walk the earth in various sort of flesh and blood incarnations or avatars. They may appear human, but equally I think you might well see a bird or an animal or, for I know, a tree, which is not what it appears to be, and is perhaps coming past to either engage with you personally or engage with somebody else near to you, and so you never quite know whether you may be, well, the Christians say about thereby entertaining angels. So I think a reasonable argument to be made, as indeed the Greeks did, that you should always be friendly to strangers because thereby you might be entertaining gods without necessarily realising you're doing so. Hopefully that answers your question, Venetia, and I'll try and work in a little bit of shape-shifting to the topic I was going to discuss, which is the idea of there being a degree of tension between different deities. Now the first deity pair I would like to think about here is Haru, whom the Greeks refer to as Horus, and his uncle Setech, which is one of many renderings of his name. The Greeks like to call him Set, Uncle Set, and Haru Horus the nephew. I'll use the Egyptian names I prefer rather than the Greek names. The story unfolds as a kind of second generation period of tension, the first generation period of tension, which forms the bedrock of the great royal myth, of which we only really have scraps surviving in Egyptian sources. The clearest version of the great royal myth comes to us from a Greek source, and it has been speculated by some historians that the Greek source may not be wholly accurate or wholly reliable, but perhaps a version of the Egyptian story made more palatable for Greek literary tastes. But it's the version we have. So it's the version we have to go with until somebody finds some ancient hieroglyphs that can be translated to produce a better version, or a sort of a more reliable original Egyptian version of the Great Royal Myth. But the long story short is that the two brothers, Setek and Azur, whom the Greeks like to call Osiris, existed in a state of tension as Osiris, or Azar, was on the throne as the reigning pharaoh. There was a man of peace and knowledge and wisdom who liked to traverse the earth, spreading insights to many, many cultures that he came across, not just to Egypt itself, but to sort of bring education to the world. And his brother Setech was of a more military bent, more interested in a bit of conquest, and felt he would make a better leader. So rather than a leader focused on art and science and culture and law and order and peace, it should be a leader focused on conquest and territory and expansions and imperialism and so on. This tension between the two brothers eventually tipped over, whereby Setech planned, upon the return of his brother from his latest expedition around the world, there's going to be a big celebration, he would present his brother with a gift. It was a common way of celebrating the return of the pharaoh, that all of the grand and the good would get together and present gifts to the pharaoh, and this is pretty much what was going to happen. And Setech presented a huge box, ornately carved and painted and decorated, made to the exact shape of his brother's body. And the box was open, and his brother was invited to get into the box and try it for size to see what a perfect fit it was, whereupon the lid was slammed down and nailed into place by the 72 Shamsu, the followers of Setech, who had been waiting for that very moment with hammers and nails and what have you to bang the lid down. And it was then carted down to the River Nile and slung in. And Azar, or Osiris if you prefer, died. Now, whether he drowned or whether he asphyxiated in the sealed sarcophagus, because it was the very first sarcophagus, is, I suppose, a bit of a moot point, but die he did, and was eventually found and resurrected briefly, and through that resurrection mated with his sister wife Azet, or Isis if you prefer, as the Greek name favours, and fathered a son who went on, was in due course born Heru, or Horus. And his father being dead, his mother went into hiding with him to protect her newborn child from the envy and resentment of his uncle, who would always see him as a bit of a rallying cry. Now, this is as an idea obviously reflects many, many, many historical incidences from around the world in which a ruler is overturned and a son, a grandson, a nephew, a niece, some relative survives, and whoever it is that's done the overthrowing of the old ruler fears that the forces loyal to the old ruler will rally around the young heir apparent and one day rise up to overthrow the upstart. So as a sort of a political scenario, this is something that crops up the world over. And this is simply the Egyptian variation in the theme. So there's a lot of tension and rivalry between uncle and nephew, with the uncle constantly trying to bump off his nephew to ensure that he cannot become a rallying cry for forces loyal to the dead father. And the nephew, with the aid of his mother, who is always one step ahead of Setech, seeks to overthrow his uncle, to restore the bloodline, although technically they were all of the same bloodline, but to restore the honour of his murdered father by one day acceding to the throne himself. And so this warfare between uncle and nephew goes on for decade after decade after decade, and there's battle after battle after battle, one skirmish after another, and sometimes Setech gets the upper hand, and sometimes Heru gets the upper hand, and there is, coming back to your question, Venetia, a lot of shape-shifting in those stories of the fights, where sometimes they're battling each other in the guise of hippopotamuses, for example. So they're not always battling each other in divine form, sometimes it is in other forms. And as a story theme, that is echoed in other cultures in other parts of the world. So, for example, in the Tombouctou in Ireland, which is one of the great grand tragedies of Irish mythology, there is an opening episode in that story, kind of a prologue really, in which two druids have been at each other's throats since the year dot, And they constantly either reincarnate or shapeshift, you can interpret it either way, but they keep coming back in different guises, and no matter what shape they're in, they're always fighting and feuding with each other. So the idea of pagan witchcraft and warfare is nothing new. We get these two ancient druids swinging their sickles at one another, and eventually they reincarnate or shapeshift into the form of two massive magical balls. And the two balls fight and battle each other at the culmination of this great, long, bloodthirsty saga, the Tombakulu. But again, it's that idea of two souls locked in immortal combat, coming back in one form after another, after another, after another, and the warfare going on and on and on and on. A key difference is that the warfare between Setech and Heru is eventually resolved, whereas the battle between the two druids in the Irish myth doesn't quite resolve. One bull kills the other, but there's nothing to say they don't just reincarnate in yet another shape to continue their fight in yet new forms. So there's no real resolution in the Irish story, but there is in Egyptian myth. But peace does eventually break out after a long and rather sleazy series of battles, which includes some sexual acts which I will gloss over for the delicately minded who might be listening to this, between uncle and nephew, which is a reminder that the moral values of today, particularly in this age of rather puritanical internet censorship, are very, very modern views, and that people in ancient times did not understand notions like sexual assault and violation and so forth in quite the way that we understand them today. That's a factor to take into account. It's something I do talk about in the book. Do we, as modern day spiritual practitioners, try to emulate to the letter the values and ethics and standards of the ancient world, assuming, of course, those values and ethics were themselves constant over time, which frankly they weren't. They themselves were subject to change even in ancient times. But do we seek to replicate that, or do we stick with modern day virtues and values, even if they kind of sit ill with some of the ancient values? Or, as seems to be quite commonplace these days, do we try to put a modern day spin on ancient myth and somehow shoehorn in 21st century virtues and values and say to ourselves, oh no, these ancient myths couldn't possibly mean the rather unsavoury things that they appear to mean. They have to be metaphorical, they have to be understood in some rather convoluted context that enables us to put a very 21st century patina on those ancient stories and make them more palatable, so they're not quite as off-putting as sometimes they can be. Quite which approach people take is obviously entirely down to themselves, but sometimes I think no matter what approach you take to your life now, it's worth bearing in mind that people thousands of years ago did not think then as we think now about a great many issues, and that is reflected in their stories, in their cultures and traditions. But the tension we have there, coming back to the sort of underlying pattern, whether we're talking the two brothers in the first wave of that story, or we're talking uncle and nephew in the second wave of the story, we can understand this in a number of different lights, and this is something we'll reflect on, both in the book and in various podcasts that I've made over the years, as to how these stories can be interpreted. So we can take an approach that would fit well with somebody like Levi Strauss, for example, and say, well, these can be seen as metaphors for natural phenomena. So Azur, green-skinned Osiris, as the Greeks like to refer to him, is a god very much connected with the fertile strip of banks alongside the Nile. So these days not so much because of the Aswan Dam, but if we go back to a period of history before the Aswan Dam was built, the Nile used to have an annual flood, the great inundation, where an enormous quantity of water coming down from the very roots of the River Nile, long before it arrives in Egypt itself. The waters would flood down and burst the banks of the Nile and carry the muddy, murky waters with all of the rotting plants and vegetation swept down from the mountains all the way down the length of the Nile until it burst its banks. It would flood the Nile, the lands of Egypt either side of the Nile for a couple of months, and then gradually the waters would withdraw and drop. And behind them they would leave all of that rotting vegetation and drowned animal corpses and what have you as muck and murk along the left and right banks of the Nile. And it's that rotting muck which would often be referred to as the Great Stink, because clearly rotting vegetation is a bit whiffy, that would make Egypt such an incredibly fertile country that it became the breadbasket of Africa. It was importing grain all over the place. It had so much abundance. Well, not every year, clearly they had good and bad years like any other country does with their harvests, but they had, generally speaking, very, very good harvests compared to many, many other countries, thanks to that rich, dark, black loam and soil that was left either side, which is perhaps the origin of the name in ancient Egyptian language for the country itself. They didn't call it Egypt. That was from the Greek version of the name. They referred to it as Chemet, the black land, because of that rich, thick, black soil. Just as Azur or Osiris can be understood as a god of the growing plant life, particularly the crops and the fruit trees and some of the vegetation that grew either side of the banks of the Nile, so his brother Setech, the Red Lord, referred to partly because he was the god of the desert, which itself is an Egyptian word, Deshret, the red land. So the baked red soils, or sand and so of the desert, but also because he was depicted as a red-haired god, a ginger god. Well, he can be understood as the desert. So we've got here two natural phenomena: the rich, fertile land and the arid, baked, parched desert around it. And of course the desert is always encroaching on the fertile land, threatening to dry it out, threatening to, with its desert winds, whip the soil away and destroy the topsoil and leave the fertile lands as arid and dead as the rest of the desert. So there is a sort of a landscape battle going on there, partly connected to the flooding of the Nile, partly connected to the weather, to the heat of the desert sun and so on. The battle between the fertile, inhabitable, pleasant parts of the Egyptian land that could be lived in ancient times, before water could be pumped quite as far away as it can be these days with modern technology. People's sort of regions of habitation were a bit more defined and limited by the technology of the day, than just as ours are expanded by the technology of our day. But the tension between the god of the fertile regions and the god of the arid regions were two brothers. It can be understood in that context. And when the father dies and the son battles to inherit the throne once occupied by his dead father, he then becomes the patron of the fertile lands. In terms of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is the bit closest to the Mediterranean Sea, is the area most associated with Haru, with his governorship. And that again has lots of the areas where the Nile Delta breaks off into lots of subsidiary rivers going out, lots of papyrus plants grow there, so a huge amount of industry in terms of papyrus production in ancient times. A very, very fertile region of Egypt. He was chiefly associated with the fertile lands, just as his uncle remained associated with the more sterile areas of land which were forever encroaching upon those fertile areas. So we can understand the tensions in that sense, that the myth becomes an accounting for geography. But we can also understand that that geography is simultaneously external, the actual land, the actual river, the actual sun and the sky and so forth, but also internal, as metaphors for the human condition. And indeed maybe metaphors for the non-human condition, because who's to say it's only humans that sit around thinking about these things. There are aspects of the human mind which are very creative, very fertile. Just as our bodies can be fertile, so our minds can be fertile, filled with art and music and science and inventiveness and creativity in an industry and churning things out left, right and centre. But there are also parts of us which are more, shall we say, arid, more sterile. And it's as much of a seasonal thing as anything, because it's remarkably difficult to be creative 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's exhausting. And just as in our colder northern climates, the farmlands and the forests and the meadows and what have you can only be putting out fruit and flowers and crops a certain amount of the year, and then we have to have winter for the land to rest up and stop producing. So in Egypt they don't have a cold season, but they do have a red hot baking fiery season when the land dies back, just as over here it dies back in cold. In Egypt it dies back in heat, and the crops wither and dry up and die, and the animals often, well perhaps not so much these days with modern technology, but certainly in the past, would often wither up and die and all things. So that a dead season, and Setech is the dead season. But everything needs a dead season. And this is important to remember, because these tensions are only tensions at a casual glance, because underneath they are necessary opposite sides of a coin. You cannot have one side without the other. You cannot have the creative without the sterile, you cannot have the sterile without the creative. There has to be both in conjunction. If you invest, somebody invests their effort in writing a book, well, the time you spend writing a book is time you're not spending painting pictures or writing poems or basket weaving or whatever thing you might be doing instead. So you become, if you like, less creative or sterile or arid or whatever word you want to use in one area of your life. You stop creating in that area because you are focused on creating in this area. So your creativity goes that way, it doesn't go that way. And so there has to be balance between the two. And there has to be times when you stop creating at all. When you have time to put your feet up and rest and relax and flop back. Now, whether you do that when it's cold or whether you do that when it's hot or some other temperature season of the year is entirely up to you, but there has to be a period of rest and relaxation. And so Setech, for all the bad press he gets as this god of the wild desert and the dangerous animals of the desert like scorpions and so on, as a god of wild desert storms and the night time and sort of the more frightening elements, is nonetheless a deity absolutely necessary to the balance of not only nature, but or in terms of external nature, but also of internal human nature, as a deity who leads us to understand those restful times in life. With perhaps, shall we say, an underpinning guidance, warning, whatever you want to call it, that if we do not willingly take rest, then we burn out. And when we burn out, it may take a hell of a long time to get back to a fertile period again. And so the heat or burning out is there for those who do not willingly give to Setech and rest up and allow a period of infertility, a period of aridity, a period of not creating every minute of every day. The alternative is burnout. So there is that sort of underlying balance there between the red lands of the desert and the green fertile lands of the Nile Delta and the Nile Strip down along the body of the Nile. I'll just check for some questions. Hold on a second. We've got a few more comments appearing there. Hello Nigel, I'll put the link up once I finish butchering at people, so you can find it from there. Nigel's asking about the book links, so I'll put that up for you. Hello Karis. Makes a change. I finally remembered something. The brain does work occasionally, but only occasionally. So there's those sort of underlying tensions there now. Um, in the wider cosmology, and this is something I mentioned in the book, obviously, plug, 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 there is a bigger tension and balance in the cosmos, not simply between individual deities, but between cosmic principles. And the two I'll give brief reference to, because I'm going to try to stick to the finishing at half past notion, is the twin forces of Izvet and Ma'at. Now, Izvet is the principle of chaos, of upheaval, of discord, of things being in the wrong place, and I'm trying to resist the urge to go a bit Monty Python and talking about things being lost, but the misplacing of order in the world. And Ma'at, by contrast, is order, is harmony, is balance, is things where they are meant to be. It's associated with beauty. Now, you can take that in a very kind of physical sense of beautiful people, beautiful animals, beautiful buildings, beautiful whatever. There is a strong sense that, particularly if we're thinking of buildings, and indeed of people, something I very, well not people, but the buildings I very briefly mentioned the other week in a talk on eco-psychology. The golden mean is a concept that's been people have been aware of for quite some time now, about the mathematical proportions associated with buildings, but also with faces. So in art and photography and things like that, there are mathematical proportions associated with the layout of the face, which are widely regarded by almost everybody as beautiful. And when some faces are not in those proportions, if their eyes are too wide apart, too close together or whatever, it's exactly that. It's the notion that there is a harmonious width, a mathematical proportion, and when it's out of sync, too much or too little, it's odd to look at, and strange, and a bit unpleasant in some respects. Just as buildings designed with mathematical proportion are harmonious, and those without it are all over the place, and discord and not particularly easy buildings to live in or work in. There is built into the notion of Ma'at that sense of order and proportion and things being in the right relationship. Now you can understand that at a more kind of a mathematical level, something which the goddess Seshet, who is the goddess of libraries, and don't you just love the idea of a culture which had a goddess of libraries? Every culture should have a goddess of libraries. Seshet is also associated not only with libraries but with mathematics, and the harmony and the beauty and the proportion of mathematics, which of course is at the root of music, and something no doubt Caris and David could wax lyrical on, the mathematical proportions and harmonies within both instrumental music and vocalization, singing, chanting, etc. There are harmonious ways to do it, and there are discordant, jarring ways to do it. So there is that sense of proportion that comes from number. But it's also the notion of right relationship in society. The appropriate relationship between husbands and wives, between parents and children, between the pharaoh and the population, within any organisation or family setup or dynamic or ritual group or whatever it may be. There are right relationships, and then there are wrong relationships. One of the problems with the whole tension between Setech and Heru, between uncle and nephew, is that is a wrong relationship. It's wrong in all sorts of dodgy sexual ways we won't go into, but it's also wrong in that they are at loggerheads when, as family members, they should be in harmony, not trying to murder each other, but trying to work together for the greater good. And so it is Ishvet, it is discordant, it is out of harmony, out of kilter. And certainly in the chapter on looking at ethics and philosophies, this is a notion that pans out into modern Kemetic understanding for those who follow Egyptian deities. But it can also, I think, apply equally well to talking about many other forms of paganism and probably non-pagan religions too. This notion of what we consider proper order, proper harmony, what is right and is correct, how things should That's a key focus. That these two cosmic forces are not like the Christian or the Jewish or the Islamic understanding of God and Satan at each other's throats, or Shaitan if you're Muslim rather than Satan, English. Rather, these are two cosmic principles, one pushing direction, a bit like the notion found within many magical lodges of the sort of more golden dawn type of nature, that there is a great plan, a certain format. If you want to get all good omens from it, then you might talk about the ineffable plan. But there is this plan. It's not just random shit happening all over the place, but rather there is a harmony to the universe. It is unfolding in a certain way when it's allowed to. And the problem is it's not always allowed to. Other forces involved that are trying their damnedest to disrupt that harmony. The biggest cosmic force involved, at least as far as the Egyptians were concerned, is Apepi, the Great Serpent, which may have inspired ideas around the serpent in the Garden of Eden and so on, or it may not. That's a whole other debate in and of itself. But there are very positive representations of snakes in Egyptian mythology. It's not all negative, so that's not. We won't go down that route. But Apepi is this kind of colossal snake of similar dimension, perhaps in the grand mystical scheme of things, to Yorungada, the wild serpent of Norse mythology. It is a bloody big snake, in other words. And it's always trying to cause chaos and disorder and devour the god of the sun, to devour Re, and cause mayhem wherever it goes. But Apepi is not alone. There are many people who knowingly or unwittingly serve Apepi, who give themselves over to chaos. Not necessarily for the whole of their lives, they can redeem themselves, buck their ideas up a bit, but there are a lot of people who become agents of disorder, agents of poison, agents of disruption. And it's not automatically because they're doing terribly wicked, evil things, because this is the key thing. Disruption and chaos and disorder are not the same as the modern day understanding of good and evil, where we might associate evil with the likes of Jimmy Savile or Jim Jones in the People's Temple of Guyana, and Stalin and Pol Pot and Hitler and people like that. It's not necessarily that kind of awfulness, although it can be. But it begins at the small scale with things falling out of order, falling out of proportion, not being done appropriately and harmoniously. And in many respects it has certain similarities to ideas within Taoism about what happens when you do not have proper relationships between people. When people stop treating each other well, stop treating their animals well, their farm animals and pets and so on, stop treating the land well, that kind of chaos and disharmony and disorder unravels the universe, and it starts small and then builds up and becomes something eventually much worse and much more difficult to deal with and much more awkward. But you could argue that maybe it's most difficult to deal with, in a sense, really, when it's small, because it's not obvious. Someone who is a bit of like a pantomime demon king striding around, twirling their big moustache and being right Nelly, is easy to spot. You can see them a mile off because they're a right crap. But more challenging to deal with, because sometimes you're never even really sure if you have misread a situation or slandered someone who is not as bad as you think they are. But in terms of Isvet, they are perhaps on the path to discord and disharmony. And the response to that is to bring more harmony into the world. Not to scream and shout at them on social media and turn into a complete fruitcake yourself, but to become a source of greater order, greater harmony, greater peace, greater balance. The more misery they bring, the more harmony and happiness you should bring to counteract what they're causing and what they're doing. Is that message? Okay. Right, that's obviously a few internet issues going on here. If it's too much of a mayhem, I'll listen back to it later, and if it's too discordant, I'll perhaps record a native version of this talk through some other platform and put it out there for anyone who's interested. But hopefully the technology won't get too bad. It's gin, by the way, if anyone's wondering. You have to worship at the fountain of gin. The other tension worth mentioning is something that Venetia gave a talk on at the Ipswich Moot last month, when she was talking about the goddess Sekhmet, the lion goddess. There's the story of Sekhmet and the goddess whom the Greeks like to refer to as Hathor. I prefer the term Hetheru, the title Hetheru, but Hathor is fun. When Ray was being driven mad by humanity, begging and pleading and whining and imprecating against other human beings being wicked and terribly awful, he eventually got just so fed up with it, he roared in wrath and anger, and Sekhmet leapt from his beak and landed forepaws down on the desert sand. The great lioness goddess, who was the expression of divine anger and wrath, stormed about the land, about the world, eating the wicked, the terrible, and the awful, which must, I imagine, have taken quite a while, given how many awful people there are in the world. But she stormed around and she ate lots of dreadful people. But she got such an appetite for it, she didn't cease with the dreadful people. She continued devouring a little bit less dreadful and a little bit less dreadful than that, until there was the threat that she would just end up eating everybody eventually. Because when all is said and done, whilst some people are very, very, very awful, most of us are capable of being awful. This is the trouble. When you call out for justice on the wicked, you often forget that you might be quite wicked to the eyes of some people, and that justice might descend on you too at some point. There's always a risk. So people began to beg and plead to Ray to withdraw his wrath, to become clement and forgiving and merciful. And so he instructed humanity on what to do, to create a great lake of red beer that would look like blood. So when Sekhmet came along at night, because obviously lionesses are active primarily hunting in the night time, there's a lot of nocturnal activity in the Lion Kingdom. She'd come along and she'd see the lake of red beer, think it was blood, and drink it all up, which she did, and pass out drunk in a heap. When she awoke in the morning with the dawn light and the beer wearing off, she transformed from the wrathful lioness into the peaceful cow goddess, Hetheru, the goddess of love. So from wrath emerged love, emerged gentleness, emerged romance and passion and beauty and so forth. And so we have this tension between the wrathful lioness and the loving, gentle, forgiving cow goddess. And that as a reflection perhaps on a whole raft of issues, such as the role of world leaders. There has to be a balance between severity, between justice and mercy. And I think that as an idea also emanates through Kabbalism. Perhaps in the period of time the Jews spent in Egypt may well have picked up a lot of ideas, including this idea, and it may be infiltrated into the much later notions of Kabbalism, and the pillars on the tree of life of Geburah and Chesed, of severity and mercy, of those two balancing forces. Too much of one and you turn into a tyrant, too much of the other, you turn into a wet weekend and everybody walks all over you. You need the balance between the two. And so it's, as we were saying about the contrast between periods of aridity and periods of fertility. There needs to be a shifting in balance between these forces. It's not a case of all one and none of the other. One side is all good, the other side is all bad. It's not that at all. It's understanding all things in proportion, all things in balance and in harmony. That's what creates a sense of health, a sense of wholeness, a sense of wholesomeness, is getting that balance right. So 2 male figures on one myth and 2 female figures on another. Does this reflect an understanding of gender in the ancient world? Possibly. May well reflect ideas that people back then had about masculinity and ideas they had about femininity, or it may simply reflect experiences common to all human beings, male or female, that we have these dualistic aspects to ourselves, and we need to strike a degree of balance between being very romantic and drawn to people, attached to people, being forgiving of them, being kind to them, merciful to their weaknesses, but also sometimes kicking their asses and having the severity of Sekhmet, having that forcefulness, having that strength to crack down on the wicked and the corrupt. And of course, the wicked and corrupt Sekhmet was cracking down on were the agents of Izvet. But to paraphrase Russian novelists, the line between good and evil runs not through the cosmos but through the human heart. To put it in an Egyptian context, the line between Izvet and Ma'at is in here, is in the Ab of the human heart. It's in all of us. We all have the capacity for Izvet. We all have the capacity for Ma'at. It's just finding a balanced way forward. That's the very notion of Ma'at, is balance, is harmony, is getting things in the right proportion, in the right juncture, so you don't get overwhelmed by one, nor equally do you get underwhelmed by the other. For those of you like Carol, I'm not sure if Carol is here at the moment, I can't quite see her name on the screen, but if she is, Carol's very keen on Carl Jung and the teachings of Carl Jung, which I've done quite a few podcasts on over the last year or so. One of the points that Jung made, which is an idea he got from Greek astrology and Greek medicine, ancient Greek medicine, which itself was heavily influenced by Egyptian ideas, is that for the Greeks there were the 4 elements. It's not quite the same in the Egyptians, but for the Greeks 4 elements, they existed as 2 pairs, water and air and earth and fire. And you'd get people who sometimes were far too much of one and not very much of the other. And that leads to significant imbalance. The Greeks believed it would lead to physical illness and mental illness and so on. And Jung also said that an imbalance in temperaments would create a very tilted, very unhealthy, dysfunctional personality. And so you'd always need to beef up the weak side to achieve balance. The person who was too much fire would need to beef up their earth. The person who was too much water would need to beef up their air to achieve that sense of balance. So again, this is an idea coming out here that when you have these forces in contrast to each other, if you have way too much of one, you need to develop more of the other to achieve a sense of balance, to achieve a sense of harmony in your way forward in life. But that brings us to 8:30, and I miraculously managed to stay on time for first time in ages. Does anyone have any questions or comments or feedback? Let's just scroll in the comments section here. Or any subjects you'd like to ask a question about or chuck in a little bit more on, and I can respond to that. Whilst people are typing away, the other thing I've got to mention is my publisher has suggested we do a sort of competition thing for a free book to be sent off. So what I'm going to do is pose your question, and between now and probably the next 10 minutes or so, when I finish butchering inanely at you, as many of you as know the answer, type it. I'll put your names in a hat, draw one out, and the name I draw out of the hat will get a free copy sent to them by my publisher. So the question is, what colour hair does Sekhmet, god of the desert, have? So if you post your answer, assuming you want a copy in the first place, and you might not, of course, By now you might be fed up hearing about it. If you'd like a copy, type your answer in the comments section and I'll put all the names in a hat this evening, draw one out, and I will notify you and notify the publisher, and there will be a book winging its way across to you, which will save you 11 quid. There's a comment from Venetia that Sekhmet would be eating very well at the moment. I'm inclined to agree. There's quite a lot of corruption and isvet in the world these days. An awful lot of devouring would go on. And yes, she would be very, very well fed if she ever decided to go out for a picnic. I suspect humans maybe are a little bit like Pringles, that once you've popped one, it's hard to stop. And they're a bit moreish in the desire to eat more and more and more of them. Venetia asked, do I think Setech is as bad as he's portrayed? The short answer is no. The long answer is no but. In that he's often portrayed in books written by people from a, shall we say, a more academic point of view, where they're not writing about deities they believe exist or they have direct experience of. They're writing about what to them, I suppose, are fictional figures in ancient stories that they've done a bit of perhaps quite a lot of research into, but they're essentially describing what to them are fictional characters. And often there is this tendency, which I personally think goes back to the Victorians and their habit of treating Greek myth as a template for all other myth, and to fit in this idea that what's true of one culture, one set of myths, must be true of all others. Or there's a king of the gods here, so every mythology must have a king of the gods, and it's just a case of finding them. That kind of identikit reading of mythology. And so which also, not only in terms of their understanding of Greek myth amongst the Victorians, but their understanding of Christianity as well. And so there's a lot of authors and writers who tend to think of Setech as a Satan figure. Now, in fairness, it's something that can be tracked back as a point of view way, way before the Victorians, back to the Egyptians themselves, when there was a big rift in ancient Egyptian history. Egypt was under the dominance of a number of imperial powers. Rome was one of them, the Greeks had a presence there, various other nations had a presence. One body of people who had a presence in Egypt for quite a long stretch of time was a nation, a tribal group called the Hyksos, who proved to be a bit of a mystery for historians, in that no one's absolutely certain where the Hyksos came from, or indeed where they went back to. They're a bit of a mystery group, who the Hyksos are. Various arguments are made, but nothing definitive. The Hyksos took over Egypt, chiefly in terms of taking over the running of the court, as it is a common practice in a lot of forms of invasion. It's not necessarily that millions of people from one country descend on another, rather that a big military force turns up, makes it very clear to the other country that if they don't play ball they will get slaughtered, and then leaves a controlling government, a sort of a de facto aristocracy in power. So numbers-wise, there may not be many of them. So if we think, for example, of the British Empire in India, there weren't millions and millions and millions of British people living in India during the Victorian era. There was a governing elite backed up by a massive amount of military might that could be called on if they were needed. And it's probably the same with the Hyksos. There may not have been vast numbers of them in Egypt, but there was enough of them to control the courts and back up their edicts with a threat of violence. They had their own gods and goddesses, but they, during their stay in Egypt, developed quite a considerable liking for Set or Setech. So he became very much associated with them, to the point where he was often described as a god of foreigners, because even though the Hyksos were in Egypt for several generations, they were still viewed as that foreign lot that occupied our country. Eventually they were driven out, and when they were driven out, Set began to get a bit of a bad press, even amongst the Egyptians themselves. And so they came to see him as the enemy of Osiris. So you could take the reading again that we've given this earlier of the tension between the desert land and the fertile land, or the notion of Osiris as a god intimately associated with agriculture and crops. And of course the whole point of crops is that when they're ripe you cut them down. Their death is integral to their value. So the plants are cut down, they die, and are not seen again until they resurrect in the next spring and the next burgeoning forth. But who is it that cuts the crop down? Whoever is wielding the scythe or the sickle. And so you could see Azur's murder is being cut down as symbolic, perhaps, of Setek harvesting the grain, performing a necessary death. But it came to be seen increasingly as murder, betrayal, something wicked, rather than as a harvest. So even amongst the Egyptians there was this sort of political shifting where politics had a direct impact on mythology and religion, as it has continued to do in Lord knows how many countries around the world ever since. And that's something to think about in itself, the way in which politics interferes with religion and reshapes, retells, spins mythology to suit its own purposes. That's a discussion for another time. All of that said, Setek is not cuddly, he's not fluffy, he's not some dear sweet old uncle. He is a ruthless force. He does what needs to be done, no matter the risk, no matter the potential for harm to others. If something needs to be done, he will be the one to go and do it, even if that means getting his hands very, very, very dirty. He's not someone to stay his sword out of squeamishness. You can connect that with people engaged in warfare who do what needs to be done, even if afterwards they have to live with the nightmares forevermore, even if you would be absolutely horrified to know what your nice old uncle or auntie or whoever it might be did during the war. They did what they needed to do, and Setek has that kind of ruthlessness. So he's certainly not cuddly, but I don't think he is this sort of Satan-style demonic presence that he is sometimes described as being in books published from the Victorian era onwards. He's not a stand-in for Beelzebub. He's a very different character and a very different force. I think that may be the only question I can see so far. Does anybody else have any other questions, or are you finding yourselves having had quite enough of me talking to you for one evening? Okay, so we're 8:14 now, so I'll aim to finish by 8:45 at the absolute latest, which gives time enough for anyone to type in an extra question or personal view, personal feedback. Maybe Vinesh, you might want to chip in with your own personal view of the set, how you experience them, etc. But to finish, we have obviously many museums all over the world which have Egyptian artifacts in them, Egyptian statues, coffins, objets d'art, what have you, including just up the road from where I live in our local museum. There's an Egyptian collection the bulk of which was donated in the Victorian era by some local wealthy dignitaries, an admiral and his wife, who travelled a lot abroad and brought things back with them. What I'm rambling around is that Egyptian religion, Kemetic religion in ancient times, was very much centred in the geography of Egypt. It was for people who lived in Egypt. End of. The Romans brought the worship of Isis or Azet out to a much bigger audience. Where St. Paul's stands now, there was once a temple to the goddess Isis in Roman times. So that spread Egyptian practice over a much wider area. Whether, obviously, a lot of people can't afford it, forget about COVID and all the issues with air travel at the moment. Even in the good times, not everyone can afford to travel to Egypt, or if they can, maybe it's a once-in-a-lifetime trip rather than a regular thing. But most of us can get to a museum which has an Egyptian collection in it. And the objects in those collections, there's all sorts of kind of arguments about one nation plundering the treasures of another nation and so on. But having seen a number of different museums around the country with Egyptian collections, some of them have a terrible sadness about them, and some of the objects there, thinking with my animist hat on here, some of those objects really do not seem very happy being there. We would much sooner be, presumably, back home in Egypt, buried under half a ton of sand. Other objects, on the other hand, seem quite content and enjoy the attention. Thinking of some statues, for example, which remain, in as much as it is physically viable to engage with a statue in as public a space as a museum, remain objects of worship. I've been in museums and seen people obviously quietly praying in front of a statue that's on exhibit in a museum. And some of those statues seem more than happy to receive such dua, which is the word for adulation, devotion, respect, to give dua. And so even if you can't get to Egypt, or at least not very often, once in a lifetime, as I said, you could nonetheless go to a museum and communicate with the objects there. The objects that are unhappy, perhaps to communicate with them, try and massage them, and obviously you can't do much of anything. If you say to the museum, that chalice does not look very happy, then the museum staff are not going to do much about it except escort you off the premises. But you may be able to negotiate with the animist presences within the objects to help them feel more content with their lot until such time as maybe some of them can be returned to Egypt. And for those objects that are very happy with their lot, give them the dua that they would like, the reverence, the respect, say some prayers, make a small offering that's suitable to the environment, engage with them, speak with them, communicate with them, and it can be a kind of a stepping off point for engagement with the spirit of the old gods, the Netjeru in the wider sense. There's been a few extra comments here, which I'm a bit behind on, so I'll just trace back over the comments. From Venetia, talk about the opening of the mouth ceremony. Yes, the opening of the mouth. There's a similar ceremony I've seen carried out in Hindu temples, not with the mouth but with the eyes, painting on pupils to not all of the statues, but certain statues, as part of a ceremony that then brings that statue to life. And ceremonies in Shinto temples in Japan, where there's certain things that are done to specific statues to bring them to life, which are akin to the opening of the mouth, of bringing life, bringing speech. And the opening of the mouth ceremony is about granting the power to communicate to something that is temporarily denied it. The newly dead, once they'd been through their mummification ceremonies, would have the opening of the mouth ceremony performed, so that when they arrived in the afterlife, they would be able to speak both to the assessors of the dead to explain to them that their good and bad deeds, but also to speak to their living relatives and receive offerings from the living, so that the power to acquire speech is both for the deceased, but also for objects like statues and so on that might not automatically have that power that can be granted it. And so there might be the capacity, I suspect, depending on the museum and what you can or cannot get away with. It doesn't even have to be done sneakily. The Manchester Museum set up an arrangement with an ancient British body that had been disinterred and put on display in the museum for people who wanted to pay their ritual respects, light a candle, say a few prayers. The exhibition was set up in such a way that they could do so openly rather than furtively. And some museums now are going all terribly multicultural and everything else. If they're spoken to, they're approached, somebody emails them, writes them a letter, whatever, might be willing to accommodate the fact that some of the objects on exhibition are, to some people, sacred objects, not just bits of interesting tat in a glass case, but religious objects, sacred objects that they want to engage with in a religious way. And the museums might be willing to accommodate some kind of movement for that, so people can go and pray in front of objects or leave specified types of offering in front of that object and not be treated as nutters, the staff at the museum, and not have their offerings thrown in a bin or anything as disrespectful as that. Would be treated in a certain way. So there's room to engage openly, as well as perhaps for those museums that are not very accommodating, where you might have to be a little bit more discreet about how you engage with objects of reverence, objects of adoration. Yeah, I agree entirely with Venetia about things. I've not been to the Petri myself yet, but I can totally understand from similar experiences in other places. But we've just gone past 8:45, so I will wind my neck in now, and I'll go through and see who's put up the correct answer for the question of what colour hair Setek has, and I will let you know if you've won a copy of the book. But thank you for listening, and I will check the sound quality on this later. If it's really bad, I'll do a new recording in a different format and put it up on the blog page. But hopefully maybe the sound recording is better in playback than it is on the sort of live version, as it were. And I will be organising an actual real-world book launch, probably later in June or early July. I'm just waiting to hear what the hell is going to happen with the COVID situation, with the new variant coming out of India, whether we're going to end up in yet another bloody lockdown, or whether it will be viable to start booking venues again. And once I know for certain, then I will progress with that, and we can have a sort of a meet-up for those who are able to come, have a few drinks and whatnot, and I can sign a few copies of the book and chat to people about what's in it and so forth. But thank you all for listening, and take care, and I will catch up with you all, no doubt, soon. Bye-bye.